Hey everybody, this is Russ from RetroGamecore. So the other day I released a video talking about the Xbox Series S and how it works as an emulation system. And as you saw in that video, I was thoroughly impressed. The amount of gaming that you can get out of that one device for $300 is pretty amazing, because on top of being able to play just about the entire Xbox catalog, it also works well as a very powerful emulation console. And I think for $300 it's an incredible gaming value. Now there are probably ways that you could squeeze by getting better performance for under $300. For example, if you bought a used Office PC and then souped it up with new components. But off the shelf for $300, I think this is the best value in emulation that you can probably find. So in today's video, I want to show you how to set up RetroArch on the Xbox Series S. But a couple caveats first. Number one, this is not only limited to the Xbox Series S, you can do it on the Series X as well, and actually get a little bit better performance. And on top of that, this also works on the Xbox One line of devices. So if you have anything from the OG Xbox One all the way up to the Series X, this method is going to work. And the next disclaimer is that this is only one of several ways to play games on your Xbox. But that being said, this is the only one that's actually official, because we're going to use the official dev kit activation app to boot into the development sandbox within Xbox, and then run the official RetroArch Xbox build. And the other methods, they involve getting your account whitelisted and then accessing private apps that other people are maintaining. And honestly, I'm not a big fan of that, because it circumvents the official Microsoft development mode, which I think is actually cool of Microsoft to offer in the first place. So in this video, we're only going to focus on the official method using the official RetroArch build. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get started. Now first thing, I want to give credit where credit is due. So this channel here, called Arcades Games, is a goldmine when it comes to Xbox emulation. This guy has just a ton of videos that go really into detail about every little thing, how to set up RetroArch, and how to configure every single console. And on top of that, he keeps all the guides updated. So if there's a new improvement or a new method to any of this emulation, he goes in and makes a new video for it. So I'll leave a link to this channel in my video description, but if you really want to get in the weeds when it comes to Xbox emulation, as far as I can tell, this is the best channel on YouTube. And honestly, a lot of my guide is modeled after some of his methods. Now one thing that does separate mine from his is that I've created an entire written guide. So in addition to this video here, I'll keep this written guide updated. So if there are any changes in the future, I'll just update the written guide for you. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing you'll find on my written guide is you need to sign up for the Microsoft Partner Program. And this will basically associate your Xbox account with a development account. So just click on the link on my website, and then scroll down until you find the Windows and Xbox program, and then click on that. And then you're going to see some guy playing with some weird contraption. Just go ahead and sign up for this. And I'm not going to show you all of the registration details, but basically you'll register for your country, and then there is a one-time $19 fee in order to set this all up. Okay, so once you've registered and paid your $19, you're going to get a confirmation screen here, and then you can click the button to go to your dashboard. And now we're going to activate our Xbox to associate with the development account. So click on the activation URL in my written guide, which will take you to this services page here. If you click on this little plus button on the top right, you'll see an option to enter activation code. So now let's go on our Xbox and get that activation code. So we're going to go into the Microsoft Store and search for the word Xbox Dev Mode. You're going to see the app pop up here. Just go ahead and grab it and install it. Now, this is the one time where things are different with the Xbox One. There's a different Dev Mode activation app. So just make sure you grab the one that looks like an Xbox One and not the one that looks like an Xbox Series. And also, don't grab Farming Simulator 19, that one's not going to work either. Okay, so once you have that installed, go ahead and open up the app. And then just go ahead and follow the prompts here. And then it's going to give you an activation code. So, type that activation code into your web browser. Hit submit. And there you go, you should now see your Xbox. Also on the Xbox side, you'll see that it activates. And actually, that's all you need to do in terms of setup. So now let's go ahead and switch and restart to enter into dev mode. At this point it'll reboot, and the first boot does take a little bit of time, but after that, here's your dashboard. Now the first thing I want to do is just clean this up a little bit, and you see that little test accounts box over here on the right? Just go ahead and hover over it, press the select button, and then hit remove. There, now you have everything that you need on the front dashboard. Your quick actions, remote access, as well as your games and apps. So the first thing we need to do is allocate some storage for the dev mode side. And this is really going to depend on how much space you plan on using. In general, I would expect maybe 100 gigs is going to be the minimum that you're going to want to use. Especially if you plan on using PS2 and Wii. I'll talk more about that later. Okay, so once you change your storage side, you'll have to restart your box. Now, once you're back into the dashboard, let's set up remote access. First thing you want to do is go into remote access settings, and under the authentication section, set up a username and password. It can be whatever you want, this is only going to be within your home LAN. Next, go ahead and make note of these addresses up above. One is going to be Xbox : and a bunch of numbers, the other one's going to be an IP address : and those same numbers. And these numbers will likely be different on your Xbox, so use the ones that are on your Xbox, not the ones that are on your screen here. Okay, once you've made note of those numbers, go ahead and close out of this window. And now let's download RetroArch because we're going to install it onto the system. So back in my written guide, go ahead and follow the link to the RetroArch page, and then scroll down until you find the Xbox Series /1 section. Here, just go ahead and right-click on the word download and download the file. Depending on your browser, it might give you an error. Just go ahead and accept any errors you find. Now, we're going to type in that Xbox : number thing, and it may also give you an error here. Just go ahead and follow through again. And then type in the credentials that you just set up in the remote access settings. And this is going to take you to your Xbox device portal. And here's where you can install apps. So under My Games and Apps, go ahead and click the Add button, and then select Choose File, and then navigate to wherever it is you saved your RetroArch app. After that, just go ahead and click on the Next button. It's going to ask you to install any necessary dependencies. You don't have any for this RetroArch build. And then just select Start. It'll take a few minutes and it might get hung up, but eventually it'll install itself. Now, back on your Xbox, you'll find RetroArch under the Games and Apps. First thing we want to do is turn this into an actual gaming app. So hover over RetroArch, press the Select button, and then select View Details. And under here, change it from App to Game. And that's all you have to do. I would recommend that you restart your console right now, just to make sure that it does go through. Okay, welcome back. Let's go ahead and start RetroArch this time. The first time you start it up, it's going to ask you to sign in, and at this point you'll actually sign in to your Microsoft account. And you only have to do this one time. And then once you're signed in, you can open up RetroArch. First thing you're going to see is that the fonts are all funky, it doesn't have any of the assets. So go into Online Updater, and then select Update Assets. This is going to install the fonts and everything else like that. And while you're in here, you might as well install some of the other things as well. For example, the core info files, controller profiles, cheats, databases, overlays, shaders. Basically whatever it is you want, you can do them all or you can do none. Next, I want to change the RetroArch theme. This one isn't bad, but I prefer the XMB one. So you go into Settings, then Drivers, then Menu, and then select XMB, or one of the other ones if you like the other ones better. Then go into Main Menu, Configuration File, Save Current Configuration. Now we're going to quit RetroArch and go back into it, and you'll see it'll have a new theme now. And there we go. I really just like using this one because it's a little bit more visually understandable, and it's pretty funny to have a PlayStation-style theme on an Xbox. Okay, let's set up more settings. Let's do hotkeys first. So you're going to go into Settings, then Input, and then Hotkeys. Within here, you want to set up a menu toggle first. Personally, I like to use the Hold Start 2-second one, but you can use whatever else you want. Now, under Hotkey Enable, I would recommend setting up a hotkey. I typically use the Select button. Next, I like to set up Close Content, which I set as Start. That way if I press Select and Start, it's going to close the game. I also like to toggle on my frames per second to the X button, as well as the menu toggle for the Y button. That way if I hit Select and X, it's going to show my frames per second, and then if I press Select and Y, it's going to bring up the RetroArch Quick menu. There are plenty of other hotkeys you can set up, but those are the basic ones I like to use. Next, let's change a little bit of the layout of the actual menu. So we're going to go to Settings again, then User Interface, Menu Item Visibility, and then within here, there's several things that you can toggle off and on. A few of these you're probably not going to need. For example, the Explore one, which actually slows down RetroArch if you have that on. And then things like images and music. If you don't use those, go ahead and take them off. And once you've tweaked everything to your liking, just make sure you go back into the main menu, Configuration File, Save Current Configuration. Now let's go ahead and quit our RetroArch and start it back up. And as you can see, you have a lot fewer things here in the menu bar, and that makes it a little bit easier to navigate. Now in previous versions of RetroArch, you actually had to download and install specific cores, but on the newest Xbox version, it has them all preloaded, so you don't have to worry about any of that, which is pretty great. Now let's set up a connection between our PC and our Xbox so we can transfer files back and forth. Back on the device portal on your PC, go ahead and select the File Explorer option. And then select the Browse button on the top right. And this is going to give you a bunch of instructions, but all you actually need is this line of code right here. So go ahead and copy that line of code, and then open up the command prompt. You can open it by hitting CMD in the Windows Start menu. Then just paste in that code and press Enter. It's basically going to save all your login credentials, so you can access your Xbox at any time from this computer. Next, make note of this File Explorer address here, which is //Xbox/development files. Now, if you actually type this into a File Explorer window, it's going to bring up your Xbox just like that. But there's an even easier way to set this up. We're going to map a network drive. To do this, in the File Explorer menu, select the Computer tab and then Map Network Drive. Within here, you need to assign a drive letter. I recommend the letter X for Xbox, and then type in that same Xbox/development files. And that's it. And now, if you go over to this PC, under Network Locations, you can find Development Files, which is your Xbox. When you open up that Development Files folder, you're going to see a folder called Windows Apps. Go ahead and open that up. Within there, you're going to find a bunch of different folders, but one of them is going to have the number of the RetroArch build and x64. That's the one we want to open up. This is basically your RetroArch folder. For example, if you go into cores, you can see all of your RetroArch cores. Now within here, we're going to make a bunch of different folders to store all of our most important files. And I have all these listed in the written guide, but it's basically going to be a systems file for BIOS files, config, saves, save states, playlists, and thumbnails. And so once you've made all these folders, we're going to tell RetroArch to use these folders instead of the default ones. That way they're easy to access. So we're going to go into RetroArch and actually set that up now. You're going to go into Settings, then Directory, and then for each of these directories, we're going to navigate to wherever those files are. So for example, under the BIOS folder, we're going to go into the S drive, and then we're going to select Program Files, then Windows Apps, and then you're going to see a bunch of folders. You're going to want to find that same RetroArch folder. It's going to be a bunch of numbers and letters, and then the number version of RetroArch and x64. It's typically going to be the second one in your list. Now when you open that up, you're going to see all those folders you just made. So for the BIOS folder, you want to select the System folder, and then select Use this directory. And that's it. Now let's do it for another one just so you kind of get a feel for it. We're going to do the thumbnails one now. We're going to go back to the S drive, then navigate down to Program Files, then Windows Apps, and then we're going to use that second one again, which is our RetroArch folder. And then we're going to find the Thumbnails folder, and then select Use this directory. Okay, let's do it one last time just so you really got it. Playlists, then S drive, then Program Files, Windows Apps, the RetroArch folder, and then which one are we doing? Playlists, and then use this directory. And it's kind of redundant, and you have to do this about 6 or 7 times, but that's really about it. And then of course, once you're done doing all this, make sure you save your current configuration. This is going to be really helpful when you update RetroArch in later versions because you can just grab all of these things and move them into the new folder. And I already have instructions in my written guide to show you how to update RetroArch using this method. So even though we're using the most recent version of RetroArch right now, this will be helpful for future versions. Okay, let's start moving over files now. We'll start with the BIOS files. Now, if you don't know what BIOS files are, they're basically system files that allow specific consoles to work. And I can't share those files because they're copyrighted and I can't tell you where to get them, but you can either dump them from an original console or maybe find them online. Either way, here's my collection of BIOS files, and I'm going to move them over into that system folder. And in my written guide, I actually have a list of all the recommended BIOS files, and while it won't have links to the actual files themselves, it'll be helpful when you're trying to create or find your own BIOS files. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about system storage. In my last video, I talked about the fact that storing Xbox games is a little bit problematic on the Xbox side. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that only certain games can be stored on an external hard drive, and the rest have to be stored internally. And so it's kind of a mess when it comes to storing games on the Xbox retail side. But on the dev mode side, it's actually a little bit more straightforward. And that's because you can actually use an external drive to store most of the game files that you want. Basically anything under 3 gigabytes is going to work just fine hooked up to an external drive like this one. When you first plug it in, it's going to ask you, do you want to use it for media, or do you want to format it so that you can use it for Xbox content? You're just going to want to select Use for Media. And that way it won't wipe anything on your drive, and then you can plug it in and out of the Xbox to load games as you'd like. Now that being said, there are some limitations when it comes to loading games on an external drive. And that's because RetroArch actually moves that game over onto the internal storage in order to load it. And that will cause some delays when it comes to booting up your games. Let me show you what I mean. We're going to start up a GameCube game here, and the file size is about 1.5 gigs. And as you can imagine, it's pulling from the external hard drive, moving it onto the internal drive, and then booting the game up. And that does cause a delay when it comes to starting your game. As you can see here, it takes about 17-18 seconds to load up a GameCube game. Now it'll be a lot faster for things like Nintendo games because they're much smaller. So now let's boot up that same GameCube game using the internal storage only. And look at that, it boots up in 2 to 3 seconds. So it's really going to be up to you whether or not you want to store things on an external drive and have a little bit of a wait, or put them all on your internal drive. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to store everything on the internal drive. So I'm going to go into the RetroArch folder and then that games folder we created, and I'm just going to start moving over a bunch of files. It really doesn't matter what you name these folders or anything else like that, because you're going to navigate to them manually when you set up playlists, which we're going to do here in a minute. Either way, what you want to do is build a ROM collection and then move that over either onto an external hard drive or internally on your Xbox. And transfer speeds are actually pretty fast. I was getting about 105 megabytes per second when transferring files from my PC to the Xbox directly. Okay, so now assuming that you have your BIOS files moved over to the internal storage and that you've set up your directory to look in that folder, and that you've also moved over game files either to your internal storage or external storage, we're actually ready to rock. So let's start setting up some playlists so we can access our games. Now there's 2 ways to set up playlists. We'll start with the easiest one first. Go over to the import content section and then select scan directory. Here we're going to navigate to wherever that game folder is. Typically it's going to be in your S drive, then program files, Windows apps, RetroArch, then games. Now if you're using an external drive, it's going to be under the E drive, not the S drive. Let's just go ahead and pick Nintendo 64 for this example. And then you select scan this directory. It's going to take a minute, it's going to scan through all the files, and then hopefully it'll recognize that they're all Nintendo 64 games, and now you're going to have a Nintendo 64 playlist. So we have all the games here, but no thumbnails. Let me show you how to set those up. You're going to go down here to Online Updater, and at the very bottom you'll see On Demand Thumbnail Downloads. Go ahead and turn that on. Now, when you go over here, you should be able to see the thumbnails as you browse through. Now, if you're not seeing the thumbnails, it's probably because the naming convention on your games doesn't match the no intro naming convention. So just refer to my written guide where I talk a little bit about that and how to set those up. Alright, so I think we're ready to actually start up a game. So we're going to pick F-Zero here. Now, Nintendo 64 has 2 different cores that you can choose from. I recommend using the Mupen 64 core here. So you just set that the first time, and then from there you can just select run and it'll boot right into it. And so here's the game here. It's running great, 60 frames per second, but it's at a low resolution. It's only running at 480p. So let me show you how to increase the resolution to upgrade it to 1080p. Assuming you set up your hotkeys, go ahead and hit select and X, or hold down start for 2 seconds. That'll bring up the RetroArch quick menu. Within here, navigate to options, and then you'll see a bunch of different options available for this specific core. In this one, you want to go into the Glide N64 section, and then you'll see 4:3 resolution. Here, change it to 1440 by 1080. After that, you need to close down the game and start it back up. And it'll actually automatically save your core options, so you don't need to save configuration file or do an override or anything else like that. And there we go, now we have 1080p gaming. Now one thing to note here, on certain cores, when you close the content, when you close the game itself, it actually boots out of RetroArch and goes back to the dashboard. And it doesn't happen with most of them, but it does happen with Nintendo 64. Okay, so now let's jump back into RetroArch, and we'll do the other method of making playlists. This is called a manual scan. Now this is very similar to the other one, but you're going to set up all the parameters yourself. For example, under Content Directory, you're going to navigate to wherever you save those games. Typically that'll be in your S drive, and then yada yada through all these folders, your games folder, and then you can pick one here. I'm going to pick Dreamcast, then scan this directory. Now under System Name, navigate to Sega Dreamcast. And then under Default Core, select the Sega Dreamcast Flycast core. And then finally, under File Extensions, you need to put all the extensions of the game files that you're using. My Dreamcast library is kind of a mess right now. So I have 3 different file types: CDI files, GDI files, and CHD files. So I'm going to type all of those in with a space between each of them. That tells RetroArch that any file that has that extension to it is supposed to be treated like a Dreamcast game. After that, you don't need to worry about the other options, just select Start Scan. This will take just a second to scan, and now if we scroll over, you can see all 4 of the Dreamcast games that I set up. So starting up Dead or Alive 2 here, you can do the same thing. You go into the options and then you change the resolution. And here I'm upgrading it to 1080p. And just like that, we have 1080p gaming on the Dreamcast. Now arcade is a little bit more complicated. You do the same thing where you set up a content directory and system name and all that, but you're also going to need an arcade DAT file. This is going to parse those weird zip file names into the actual titles of the games that you're going to want to see in the playlist. And on my written guide, I have a link to the latest DAT file. All you have to do is just download that file, and then move it over to your Xbox, and then navigate to wherever it is you saved it on your Xbox. Me, I just put it in my games folder. And so once you've pointed to that arcade.dat file, just go ahead and start your scan like you would any of the other manual scans. And there you go. So now if you go into the main folder, you're going to see all of the different arcade titles. Now there's a lot more to setting up arcade when it comes down to it, but I've provided a couple extra tips in the written guide. Honestly, it could be its own video in and of itself, but the written guide should help get you started. Okay, now let's talk about control configuration. For example, if you play the original Wind Waker, you've probably noticed that the left and right camera controls are kind of reversed from modern games. So it's actually a pretty easy fix to this. You go into the quick menu, then controls, then port 1 controls, and then you just switch your left and right analog directions. So instead of saying X minus 1, change it to X plus 1. For the X plus 1, change it to X minus 1. Now I'm one of those weird people that use inverted Y controls as well, and that's also an easy fix. You just change the Y-axis values within here. Then just back out to the main controls menu, and then select Save Game Remap File. That'll now associate this setup with this specific game. And just like that, the controls work fine. And my brain no longer hurts when I try to play Wind Waker. So it's an easy setup for any of those early 3D games that had wonky controls. Now speaking of wonky controls, setting up Wii games is also kind of a pain. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and written out all of the instructions for you on the written guide. So for example, here in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, I'm actually emulating a Wiimote and nunchuck setup. And it's actually pretty easy, it's just a matter of setting up a couple different configurations. Now one thing to note is the only Wii controls that aren't going to work are when you need to actually tilt or swing a Wiimote. So for example, you're not going to be able to play Wii Sports Tennis, because there's no way to emulate that experience with a controller. So speaking of controllers, everybody knows that the Xbox controllers are not the best when it comes to retro gaming. They're great for modern gaming, but not much else. And unfortunately, I'm sad to report that despite having a bunch of different controllers and different adapters, I was not able to get anything recognized by the Xbox. And that's because Xbox requires specific licensed models. And honestly, probably the closest that you have to a retro gaming pad is this one here. It's called the Hyperkin X91. But as far as reviews go, it's got 4 out of 5 stars, so maybe it's not too bad. And then another option is this one here called the Brook Wingman. Now I actually don't own one of these, but it looks like it's able to play specific controllers to behave like licensed controllers. And one of the YouTube commenters from my previous video actually recommended these ones here from RetroBit. So in essence, you could pay $45 for that dongle, and then another $20 for this controller, and then be able to more comfortably play retro games. Personally, I think that the Hyperkin one might actually be better for the budget, or maybe just get used to using an Xbox controller. It's unfortunate I can't use the rest of the controllers I have in my library, but that's the way the cookie crumbled. Now, speaking of things that crumble, there are many PS2 games that actually won't boot with the latest version of RetroArch. It'll go through the actual BIOS menu, and it'll show you your PlayStation 2 logo, and then it'll bump you back to the Xbox dashboard. Now there's actually a pretty easy fix to this, and that's by reverting to a previous RetroArch core, and I have that linked on my written guide. So what you're going to want to do here is download that RetroArch core, and then go into your Xbox RetroArch folder, and then under the cores folder, you're going to find all the cores. So what you want to do is grab that current PCX2 core, and then rename it to something. For me, I'm putting a 199 before it because that's the version of RetroArch it's coming from. Now I'm going to unzip the previous core that I just downloaded, and then drag that over in place. And because it has the same file name as the other one did before I changed it, it should just work seamlessly. And that's all you have to do. And now, games like Jak and Daxter, which wouldn't boot at all, can now boot. But unfortunately, it's having all sorts of graphical glitches right now, so it's not worth playing anyway. But at least you get my point in the fact that there are different ways of playing around with the RetroArch cores if you're having specific issues with a game. And finally, let me show you how to get in and out of dev mode once you're done playing around with RetroArch. You're going to select Leave Dev Mode here on the dashboard, and then on this pop-up screen, make sure that you uncheck Delete Side-Loaded Games and Apps. If you don't uncheck this, it'll delete RetroArch and everything. So make sure that's unchecked and then hit OK. Now it'll reboot you back into your regular dashboard. And to get back into the dev mode, just go ahead and select the DevKit app again, and then select Switch and Restart. Then it'll reboot your system again, and you'll be back in dev mode, and vice versa. And that's all you have to do to get in and out of dev mode. Alright everyone, I know this was a long video, and I just walked you through a ton of different tutorials, but I hope this was helpful in getting set up for RetroArch on the Xbox. And I know I've mentioned it about 10,000 times on this video already, But be sure to check out the written guide, which I have linked in the video description, which will walk you through everything at your own pace, and it'll have all the links and updates and everything else that you need right there. So if you're watching this video 6 months, 12 months after it's been released, just rest assured that the written guide is going to be maintained over time. And I know this probably seemed a little bit overwhelming. I mean, we basically took a regular old Xbox, turned it into a dev kit, and then installed and configured RetroArch. And to knock that out in the time that we did is pretty impressive. So it took me quite some time to make this video, but I hope it was super helpful in getting you started with Xbox emulation, because this is a really fun place to be. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'd appreciate it if you liked and subscribed if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.